Hey, this is the story of D'Angelo Purnell, an insurgent who dropped into Louisville via parachute alone and is now on his own in a 6 months later scenario. This is the first 30 days of my ongoing Project Zomboid live stream Insurgent series. I've curated some of the best parts. The struggle with surviving in the first 30 days has been real, y'all. Very high zombie populations, 3% day sprinters, and insanely rare loot in this very unforgiving city of Louisville. I'll list out the mods, there are too many for me to even mention. I'm using in the description below for anyone interested, and if you'd like to follow along and see if the story in its entirety unedited, I'll leave those in the description below as well. Of course, if watching live as it happens is your shizzle, you can subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and all that so you will be notified anytime I'm live on YouTube. I'm Drunkonlife, and this is the story of D'Angelo Purnell. So we dropped into what appeared to be a grocery store or a Quick Mart and immediately lost the parachute and surveyed the area. First thing we had to do was fix a pretty serious groin and right thigh injury. The second thing was loot the store of the remaining food. It had been 6 months since the zombie apocalypse, but it was quite amazing to what had been left behind. Jujubes and jelly beans, hi-his and plunkies, even cigarettes, which was really important because D'Angelo was a smoker. Outside, we could hear the moans and groans of the undead. We were pretty confident, though. We were a soldier. We had a shotgun, a machete, and enough ammo to at least get by for the day. It was foggy outside, and we could see the silhouettes in the distance. First step, clear a hole big enough to secure the immediate area. The building behind him gave the zombies just 3 ways to attack, from the left or right, and of course from the front. From behind, as you know, a zombie attack from behind is pretty much instant death. Most of the zombies were slow and lumbering. Killing them was easy. The problem was they were intermingled with less slow zombies that ran at you at full throttle. He started to realize that it would be easier to get overwhelmed if we weren't careful. 1 to 2 sprinters would be easily dispatched anymore, and it could be a problem. A car immediately would have been a nice, and amazingly, Jimmy's pre-owned vehicles lot was literally next door. The first day was kind of fading away. It was getting dark. We knew that they would stop sprinting shortly. We dispatched the remaining zombies in the car and checked the cars if any of them worked. None did, but we were able to get pieces of the Louisville map. The biggest problem was getting dropped into Louisville, not knowing exactly where you are. In my case, I don't really do Louisville very often, so I really didn't know where I was. Is it safety to the east or to the west or to the north or to the south? We were tempted to head east, but ultimately decided on going west toward the river. We wound up choosing a pretty nice house, riverside, and although it wasn't necessarily secured, it would have to do. I'd love to tell you that we were able to survive and thrive from the get-go, but that would be a lie. While D'Angelo was born to kill everything else, all the other skills were pretty much lackluster. And finding supplies, things like saws and nails, were challenging. We spent the first few days kind of aimless, to be honest, looting houses throughout the neighborhood and killing all the zombies we came into contact with. But for the most part, there was no plan. The concentration of zombies in the area made it very tough to feel like we were making forward progress. We were making progress, though. Every day that passed just felt just a little safer, at least in the immediate area, finding just enough food to get through to the next day. We couldn't make doors, so we secured the house by piling furniture up against the door. It wasn't perfect, but would have to do until we could. Some of the windows were wide open as well, but without nails, there's very little that we could do with that. What we could do was make log walls because all they consisted of was logs and ripped sheets and rags, something that we had an abundance of because after 5 days, we'd killed over 800 zombies. They weren't perfect, but were enough to, in the very least, give us peace of mind that we wouldn't wake up to a zombie in our house. We also decided that we would loot in the nighttime to prevent the chance of a sprinter surprising us from behind, sleeping during the day and then going out under the cover of darkness for supplies. We gathered whatever books we could find, nothing of importance, by the way, just self-help books on emotional issues. We felt better about our place in the world, but weren't any more knowledgeable than we were before. Still, they were a good distraction from our hunger, which was growing more urgent every day. So we had a couple immediate problems. Without food, we would starve, and without tools such as a saw and nails, we wouldn't be able to get things done. Our best chances for food would be going house to house in the suburbs to the east and the south, and we might be able to find tools as well, but our best chances for tools was to the north in the warehouse district. Both would be scarce as most of the stuff had already been picked over and looted. We decided to loot the riverside houses first, and hopefully find a saw along the way, hoping that we would manage to scavenge enough food until we could attack the suburbs for more food. The plan was to work our way south along the river and then head north toward the warehouse district later on. Of course, those were the immediate challenges. We already had a safe house, although it wasn't totally secure. But we needed to eventually start working on survival skills, and finding skill books were another challenge. We also needed a generator for power and eventually a car. Like almost everything else, cars had been picked over and most were missing parts, and the ones that weren't were missing keys. Considering that we were camped out next to a gigantic river, you would think food wouldn't be much of a problem, except it was winter and fishing was more of a stress reliever than it was productive. Not a single fish after 13 days, and that's not to say we didn't try. Day 15 was a game changer for D'Angelo, as that was the day he finally found a car. Without a car, we were limited to a very small piece of Louisville, and over time, this was causing us to have to go further and further away from our home in search of food and supplies. This was a risk because getting caught outside at daybreak posed a sprinter problem, and even more so, a potential sprinter in a house would likely be fatal. We had elected to head north towards downtown Louisville, looting houses along the way. The strategy was to kill everything in front of us so we wouldn't have to worry about the zombie population getting us from behind. We would sleep in the last house at the end of Riverfront Row before the warehouse district, and then start to look for a working car in the parking lots of the warehouses the next night. Along the way, we found a gas station, a particularly good find because should we find a working vehicle and a generator, we'd have a way to gas up for future runs rather than relying on siphoning gas from cars in the city. Edging our way northward into the warehouse district would also give us the opportunity to hit the big Amazon-type warehouse eventually, where if we were lucky, we could score some farming gear as well as much-needed food. Our first car was a step van with keys. It didn't have a working battery, but we found one that was low but good enough to start the vehicle up. It also didn't have gas, but we were able to siphon enough gas to, in the very least, get us home. This was on December 24th, Christmas Eve. The night was young, and with the car, we decided to push up into the warehouse district to see exactly what we were dealing with. With luck, we could hit a warehouse or two, get in, get out sort of thing, and be home by daybreak. The warehouse district was thick with Zeds. We weaved around them, trying not to damage our van and thinking about what our plan was. Up to this point, D'Angelo had killed everything in front of him, minimizing the risk of being surrounded, and we were deviating away from the script. Should we elect to take a chance on looting, there would be zombies on every side, which was a ginormous risk to take. There was a chance that the van would be surrounded as well, and we would be stuck in the district come daylight. Nevertheless, as they say, the risk was worth the stretch. After all, while D'Angelo had a very few survival skills, what he did have was fighting skills for days. We parked the vehicle, said a prayer to any god that might have been listening, and YOLO'd it. At the time, it was 1:20 in the morning, giving us roughly 5 hours to clear the horde and at least loot a portion of the building before daybreak. He didn't bring his gun, so with just a machete and a couple knives, he started to thin the herd out. He could use his machete until he became too tired and then switch to the more lightweight knife, which was less tiring to swing. What he didn't plan for, and who plans for this, was the sheer number of zombies filtering in from the surrounding buildings. It felt like hundreds against one. The fight lasted for 2 hours and time was ticking. There were too many around his vehicle to chance a hasty retreat, and with 3 hours left, he decided to enter the building even though he was still surrounded. He'd figure out the exit later. The building was enormous, with shelf after shelf of trinkets and miscellaneous items, boots, widgets, and computers, TVs, canned food, seeds, shovels, and other things. It was having his first existential moment since landing here in Louisville. He could hear the hordes beating on the doors and walls, their moans echoing throughout from the outside. He could also hear moans from the inside as well. Had he bit off more than he could chew? Was this where it would end? Exhausted, he needed to catch his breath, if only for a moment. With about 2.5 hours left, he would need to find a second wind and perhaps fight even more. The problem was time. Time was his enemy more than the zombies outside the door. For all the stuff that had been left behind, most was completely useless in a post-pandemic world. He did find a trowel and some seeds, wood glue. He may have found more, but everything was rushed. Then the zombies breached the door. With 1 hour left, he left the warehouse unsure of what he would be met with, unsure if getting to the van would be possible. The problem with the van was there were no windows, and so in the event there was an opportunity to get in, should the van not start, he'd be a sitting duck. Exhausted and too tired to fight, and with daybreak right on the precipice, he'd have to take a chance. There were zombies near the van, but just far enough for him to make a break for it. A dozen or so more zombies were filtering in from the gate and headed towards him as well. It was now or never. Luckily, the van started on the second try, just as the Zeds were closing in on him. The time was 5:30. If it had been 30 minutes later, his story may have ended prematurely. He thought about this on his drive back home, how luck plays a big part in even tiny successes in life sometimes, and even how sometimes your lucky break can be a foreshadowing of your own demise. For example, had this been his last night on this earth, his undoing would have been his lucky break, finding a van early enough in the night to risk doing something that he would never have done had he not found the van. And then getting into a vehicle with zombies feet away from you and hoping and praying the car would start quickly. Another moment of dumb luck. Had it been the fourth try of starting, he probably would have not gotten out alive. While finding a car was a huge morale boost, food, or the lack thereof, was always the problem. There are only so many houses you can loot in a night, and considering that most would yield close to nothing, starvation was a true killer. In just 15 short days, D'Angelo had lost close to 15 kilograms of weight, and didn't look like he was going to find enough food to be gaining anytime soon. Luckily, he did find some radishes, potatoes, and broccoli seeds from his warehouse run, and decided to start planting immediately in the hopes that in the coming weeks, he wouldn't be too weak to harvest. That's supposing that they would even grow. On the plus side, he was safer than he'd ever been. He'd constructed log walls in the holes of his compound and blocked the front completely to the point if he needed to exit, he would have to jump a fence to leave. Still, those little annoyances didn't trump how safe he felt when he was at his compound. He had also decimated the surrounding population down to where if there were zombies, it was one or two, and usually migrants to the area. A far cry from when he first arrived here. This was a true safe house. Still, there was a lot left to do. For one thing, he lacked books, survival books in particular. Skill books that would teach him how to fix and construct more things, books that would help him repair his car. He'd been practicing electrical by deconstructing watches and radios and flashlights. He'd already found a few books that he read in his downtime before bed. There was still a fairly large swath of suburbs that he hadn't tackled and searched right to the south of him, and also a couple apartment buildings. There would likely be food and books at both places, but the apartment buildings seemed like they were tougher of the two. He decided he would spend the next few days actively looting the neighborhood. He would save the apartment buildings for later. On day 17, D'Angelo decided to add more security to his home by barricading the windows to his compound. He also started breaking down unused furniture for planks and firewood. His home had a fireplace which would double as an oven and provide warmth on those cold winter nights. He also tried his hand at spearfishing, but it proved to be a fool's errand. His skill set was too low, and even though he could see the fish right beneath the surface, they managed to elude his spear. The next night, we decided to tackle a neighboring block of homes that backed up to a local college, several blocks away from his compound. He imagined what Louisville would look like without zombies. As at this point, he had decided that his destiny, what he was put on this earth to do, was to do just such. Completely eradicate the zombie population from this town. It was such a ludicrous idea to him that he couldn't say it out loud, but he thought it. In fact, he dreamed about it on a daily basis. The neighborhood was remarkably quiet, but this was likely because of the amount of zombies that he had dispatched over half a month. Roughly 2,000 zombies killed in the immediate area. The plan was to go house to house searching for food and dismantling furniture, killing anything that came in the way between himself and his goals. He had a map he would mark off each house so he wouldn't waste time with previously looted houses. He would also check cars for keys and gas and whatnot, because while a step van was a good find, having knowledge of a potential backup car would be nice in the event his car bit the dust. He still didn't have enough knowledge for fixing anything worthwhile, although he had found some car magazines that showed how to fix them. What are the chances of finding a pristine police car 6 months later in the zombie apocalypse? Well, that is exactly what we found, only to discover that when we got in, we set off a car alarm. Now, had this been 4 blocks toward the river, this wouldn't have been as big of a problem. The fact that this neighborhood is directly behind the university meant that it was a big issue. We backed up to see what would come. A sensible person would have run. A sensible person would have considered that if enough came, he would likely get cut off from his source of escape, a van with no windows. But D'Angelo figured, why not cull the crowd? What was another day without much food if he could return the next day to a quiet neighborhood? They poured in from the west, what seemed to be hundreds, a direct replica of his warehouse run. He couldn't help but wonder if he had been baited. A seemingly nice car in the middle of the neighborhood that looked virtually untouched by the elements that happened to have a working alarm, even though it had been 6 months since the beginning of the apocalypse. He couldn't help but wonder if some poor soul booby-trapped it so they could retrieve it later. Maybe they were still alive. Maybe he wasn't alone in the city, or as alone as he thought he was. The thought was exciting and terrifying all at once. Up to this point, he had seen no signs of passing. On the other, this car. The thing that worried him more than the horde he faced that night was the thought of another human showing up. Humans were way more unpredictable than zombies. You know the intentions of the undead, but with another human, there's no way of predicting whether they are out to take from you or genuinely are looking for others. He fought the entire night, going back and forth from his machete to knife, over 7 hours of fighting, and left with what seemed like a never-ending wave of zombies. He wondered if he even made a dent. Bruised, tired, and somewhat defeated, he headed back home. The next day, he returned to finish what he started. A couple hundred bodies lined the streets, a sign that he was there. Driving up, he imagined another impossible task. Another night of straight fighting, but he had to do this. After all, it was a mere few blocks away from his compound, and the chances were good if he just left it as it were, that they'd eventually be on his doorstep. Plus, it was an entire neighborhood unchecked for food, and at this point, what he would give for a can of dog food. It took him 2 hours to clear the groups of zombies before he could return to the thing that caused him so much trouble in the first place. The police car. He didn't have time to check the car when the alarm went off, but now he could take a look at his prize. The engine to the car was blown, but he figured if he ever got to the point where he could do mechanics, he would gut it for parts. The rest of the night he spent going from house to house, dismantling household furniture and picking up whatever food he could find in the kitchens. It was gnawing on him like a dog gnawing on a bone. He had made it to the warehouse. He had actually made it into the warehouse, but somehow had come up empty. The houses from the previous days had netted him about a week's worth of food. He was now thinking about long-term survival, and in his mind, the warehouse would most likely provide him, in the very least, another week's worth of food. That night, he guesstimated he had probably killed 300 zombies outside. He had thinned that herd enough, he supposed, to make another run at it. On the one hand, he could simply leave it and get it when he needed it. But there was something about the cop car alarm that bothered him. What if there were groups still out there? What if he thinned out the herd just enough for someone else to raid that warehouse? What if he returned too late? It was gnawing on him. The blood and sweat he had left at that warehouse only to have the potential of it being all for nothing. On day 22, he decided he was going to head back. Only this time it would be different. He took all his remaining shotgun ammo and shotgun. The numbers were still there. This is despite the fact that he'd already killed hundreds. There is no way most would even chance trying to get in this warehouse, he thought. Still, he was here and committed. It was just approaching midnight. He'd have 6 hours to get in and get out before daybreak. The roads were thick and he could see the zombies streaming in from the surrounding area. Much like the first time, but this time he was confident that he would, in the very least, make looting the warehouse easier. And this time he had to do it, because if there were other survivors, they would likely be able to walk in without much of a problem. He figured that his mistake last time was he allowed for the potential of getting surrounded. This time he would cull the herd behind him first and attacked everything in front, leaving no possibility for him to get overrun, at least from behind. It wasn't his best plan by any stretch of the imagination. Shock and awe. But it was a much better plan than he had on the previous run. He burned through all of his rounds in roughly 2 hours. It was now 2 o'clock. 4 more hours to go. He could start to see the light, though. The herds were thinning, albeit slowly. He committed himself to staying even past daybreak if it was necessary, he told himself. There was absolutely no way he would lose the warehouse. Not this time. He finally breached the warehouse with a couple hours to go before daylight. There were a smattering of zombies still there, but not near the levels before. He finished off the zombies and started rummaging through the shelves. There were still echoes of groans that appeared to come from the offices in the front, but he figured if they didn't bother him, he wouldn't bother them. The food sections of the warehouse had been completely looted with the exception of a few dented cans of vegetables, some orange soda, and a bottle of beer and bourbon. It wasn't much, but he had to be thankful for even the smallest amount of food. He also found some broccoli seeds, a seed for future hope. When he finally left the warehouse, he could see the sun just peeking on the horizon to the east. It had been a good day. The next couple of days were spent at his compound. He had been dismantling furniture of other houses, using the wood for his fireplace where he would cook the simplest of meals, grabbing the nails for reuse. You were probably wondering why someone in the zombie apocalypse would spend so much time dismantling furniture when there would appear to be much more pressing matters that needed to be addressed in the now. To be honest, it was partially out of boredom. And for D'Angelo, building things didn't come very easy for him anyway. Some hands are naturally made to wield a hammer and saw, and some hands are destined to wield a weapon. D'Angelo was a soldier. His hands were made to kill. Doing much of anything else was a puzzle to him, whether that was working on a car or doing even something as simple as framing a door. By dismantling things, he was learning how to put the world back together, or in his case, simply install a door. And he was getting closer to understanding such tasks by the day. Up to this point, his doorways were blocked by furniture, a simple way to keep things from entering, but it was winter. Anytime the wind blew, he would feel it. With the house taken care of, he could sort out more pressing matters. He had built a small garden and planted potato, radish, and broccoli seeds, but that wouldn't yield much until spring, which was 2 months from now, but may as well have been years. This would be for the future, but with food dwindling every day and his weight dropping, he couldn't be complacent. Louisville was a big place full of opportunity, and even in his infinitely small universe of this tiny neighborhood, he just scratched the surface. To the south of him was yet another neighborhood to check out, full of presumably empty houses, another food source until the spring. Of course, just beyond the warehouses was an army surplus store and police station, both good sources of weapons, but that would have to wait. One of his finds was a generator book. He had read through it several times to the point where he felt confident that he could operate one. A generator would be a great find because he'd be able to power the stove and fridge, less food spoilage, and of course light, something that seemed like a distant memory. The apartment complex would be the most likely place for a generator close by. Tomorrow he would head there.